The curse of Blackwell Cemetery. They don't go there. That was what the people of Blackwell, West Virginia, always said. The old cemetery on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for decades, its rusting wrought iron gate barely standing against the passage of time. Thick weeds coiled around the headstones like nature's attempt to erase the memories of those buried beneath. Nathan Carter had lived in Blackwell all his life, but he had never once stepped foot inside. No one did. It wasn't just superstition. There were stories, dark ones, whispered among the older residents who still remembered the last funeral held there. People had gone missing. Shadows had been seen moving between the tombstones. And then there was the unmarked crypt, the one that should have never been opened. But Nathan didn't believe in ghost stories. At 27, he was too old for that nonsense. So when his friend, Jake, dared him to explore the cemetery one night, he accepted without hesitation. "You won't last 5 minutes in there," Jake had smirked, handing Nathan a flashlight. "We'll see about that," Nathan had replied. Now, standing at the rusted entrance, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, he felt an unfamiliar chill creep down his spine. The iron gate groaned as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silence like a warning. Taking a deep breath, Nathan stepped inside. The crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots was the only sound as Nathan made his way deeper into the cemetery. He swept the flashlight across the landscape. Rows of tombstones, some leaning at odd angles, their inscriptions faded by time. The dates ranged from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. "Just a bunch of old graves," he muttered to himself. Then he saw it. A fresh bouquet of flowers lay at the base of one of the tombstones. The petals were vibrant, untouched by decay. Someone had been here recently. Nathan frowned. Who in Blackwell would come to this place? As far as he knew, no one had been buried here in over 50 years. He crouched down, brushing dirt off the name engraved in the stone. Margaret Holloway, 1876 to 1903. She watches. She waits. Nathan's stomach twisted at the inscription. It was an odd epitaph. Who was watching? Who was waiting? A sudden rustling came from behind him. He spun, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more tombstones and tangled weeds. Probably just the wind. Shaking his head, he continued walking. But as he moved, he had the unsettling feeling that something was walking with him. Nathan's flashlight beam flickered. He smacked it against his palm. The light steadied, but a cold dread settled in his stomach. Up ahead, a structure loomed in the darkness. It was a crypt, its stone facade covered in moss and vines. Unlike the other graves, this one had no name. Nathan hesitated. Every muscle in his body told him to turn around, to leave. But the dare wasn't over yet. He had to prove Jake wrong. He stepped forward and pressed against the heavy stone door. It groaned but did not move. Then, as if in response to his presence, the door shifted slightly. It was unlocked. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Inside, the crypt was colder than the night air outside. His flashlight revealed stone walls, their surfaces damp with condensation. A stone coffin sat in the center, its lid slightly ajar. Nathan swallowed hard. Something moved behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty darkness. Then he heard it, a whisper so faint he almost thought he imagined it. "Leave!" Nathan's heart pounded. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, the heavy crypt door slammed shut behind him. Nathan ran to it, pushing against the stone with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. His breathing quickened. He turned back toward the coffin. The lid had moved. It was now fully open. Something was inside. He edged closer, his flashlight shaking in his grip. And then he saw it. A figure lay in the coffin. A woman, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted as if she had just exhaled. Nathan stumbled back. It was impossible. She looked like she had just died yesterday. A sharp click echoed through the crypt. The flashlight went out. Total darkness. And then, a breath. Not his. Right beside him, Nathan screamed. The crypt door burst open. Nathan didn't question it, he ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he sprinted through the cemetery, branches clawing at his clothes. The whispers followed him. "Leave. You shouldn't be here. She's coming." The gate loomed ahead. He reached it, shoving it open so hard it nearly came off its hinges. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Because he knew, if he did, he'd see her standing there, watching, waiting, just like the tombstone said. Nathan never spoke about that night. A week later, he left Blackwell, moved across the country, but some nights, when he closed his eyes, he still heard the whispers. And sometimes, just before he fell asleep, he swore he could feel cold breath on his neck. Nathan had hoped that leaving Blackwell would sever the connection between him and the curse. But no matter how far he ran, the whispers followed him. 3 weeks after the cemetery incident, he had moved to a small apartment in Chicago. The busy streets and bright lights should have helped him forget the horrors of that night, but they didn't. At first, the nightmares were the worst part. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the woman's pale face staring at him from the shadows of his dreams. Her voice would echo in his ears, soft and chilling. "Leave. She's coming." But soon, the nightmares began to bleed into his waking hours. It started small, an eerie sensation that someone was watching him when he was alone. Then, one evening, it happened again. Nathan was sitting on his couch, flipping through channels. The TV was on mute, the only sound in the room coming from the city streets outside. Suddenly, the screen flickered. The image went static, buzzing like an old radio tuning into a strange frequency. Nathan! It wasn't a voice from the TV show. It was a whisper, low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. His hand moved to the remote, but before he could reach it, the screen shifted. Shapes appeared in the static, blurred at first, then slowly becoming clearer. He leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. The figure that emerged from the static was a woman, her pale face hauntingly familiar. The same woman from the crypt. "You didn't leave." Her voice filled the room, resonating in his mind like a cold wind. Nathan's blood ran cold. He quickly turned off the TV, but the room still felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if she was still there, watching him. That night, he went to bed exhausted, hoping to escape the horrors in his dreams. But sleep brought no relief. The next few days were a blur of unease and paranoia. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his reach. The whispers, though quiet, never truly went away. They followed him everywhere, when he walked down the street, when he sat in cafes, even when he tried to focus on his work. And then it got worse. One evening, as Nathan returned to his apartment after a long day, he noticed something strange. The door to his apartment was slightly ajar. He always locked it, he was certain of that. His heart raced as he pushed the door open, stepping cautiously inside. The apartment looked normal at first glance. Nothing appeared out of place. But as his eyes scanned the room, he saw something that made his stomach twist. On the kitchen counter was a single black rose. Nathan stepped forward, his legs trembling. The rose looked fresh, but there was something wrong with it. The petals were unnaturally dark, almost as if they were absorbing the light around them. The stem was straight, but the thorns glistened like sharp teeth. He reached out, hesitating for a moment. As soon as his fingers brushed the petals, a coldness seeped into his skin, and a sudden wave of nausea hit him. He pulled his hand back, feeling as if something had just touched him from within the rose itself. A voice whispered behind him, "I told you, Nathan. You're mine now." He spun around, but no one was there. Nathan's breath quickened. He had to get out of there, but the whispers were already in his head, louder now, echoing from all corners of the room. "She's coming for you." Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something in the apartment had changed since the black rose appeared. The whispers had become louder, more insistent, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He tried to brush it off as stress, but deep down, he knew that something was wrong. something far worse than his mind could comprehend. That night, he tossed and turned in bed, his eyes constantly flicking toward the dark corners of the room. The oppressive silence felt like it was pressing in on him, and his thoughts kept spiraling back to the crypt, to the face of the woman in the coffin. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft creak from the hallway, followed by a faint, echoing whisper. "Nathan!" His heart raced as he sat up, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. But in the corner, near the window, he saw something. A shadow. It was tall, darker than the surrounding darkness, and it seemed to move, shifting unnaturally, as though it was alive. Nathan couldn't take his eyes off it. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. Then the shadow began to take shape. At first, it was just a silhouette, a figure standing perfectly still. But as the seconds stretched on, Nathan saw the outlines of a woman, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted, hollow grin. The woman, her lips parted, and in that instant, Nathan knew she was speaking to him, though no words were heard. He could feel the message in his bones, in the cold air that suddenly filled the room. "You cannot escape." The shadow began to move toward him, its presence suffocating. The woman's eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto his, and Nathan felt a cold, paralyzing fear settle in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if her very gaze had frozen him in place. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow faded. The room fell into an eerie silence, but the feeling of dread remained, heavy and unyielding. Nathan knew then he wasn't safe. Days blurred together after the encounter. Nathan couldn't remember the last time he had slept through the night. The whispering, the shadow, the black rose. It all felt like a nightmare that he couldn't wake from. The woman in the crypt, Margaret Holloway, had somehow followed him. She had attached herself to him, bound him with an unbreakable thread that no distance could sever. He began to see things. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, he passed a mirror in a store window. He froze when he caught a glimpse of himself. His reflection wasn't quite right. It was as though someone else was standing behind him, their hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. That night, he came home to find another black rose waiting for him. This time, there were 3. They were placed carefully on his bed, their dark petals standing out against the white sheets. Panic surged through him. He was losing his mind. He locked all the windows and doors, but it didn't help. The whispers continued, creeping into his thoughts even when he tried to ignore them. They were louder now, more insistent. They wanted him to understand something terrible. "She's waiting. She's always watching." Nathan tried to sleep, but his dreams were nightmares. In them, he was trapped in the cemetery again, but this time the graveyard was alive. The tombstones moved, the ground shifted beneath him, and the woman, Margaret, chased him, her hollow eyes fixed on him as she reached for his throat. Each time he woke up, his body was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, but he couldn't escape. The woman's presence was everywhere. Nathan's desperation grew. He couldn't live like this anymore. The woman was coming for him, and there was nowhere he could hide. His mind raced as he thought about Blackwell, the crypt, and Margaret Holloway. What if the key to ending this madness lay buried in the town's history? He had to know more. Without thinking, he packed his things and drove back to Blackwell. His heart pounded as he approached the familiar landscape, the winding roads, the old cemetery. Everything seemed to be exactly as he remembered, and yet nothing felt right. The town had an eerie, oppressive aura, as if the very air was thick with forgotten secrets. He drove straight to the cemetery, his hands shaking on the wheel. The gate was rusted, but it creaked open as he approached. Nathan stepped into the graveyard, his flashlight casting long shadows across the crumbling tombstones. The whispers began immediately, growing louder with each step he took. "You shouldn't have come back." He ignored them and made his way toward the crypt. When he reached it, he stopped. The stone door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open with trembling hands. Inside, the coffin was empty, but there was something on the floor, near the crypt's entrance. A piece of paper yellowed with age. Nathan picked it up and read the faded writing. The curse of Margaret Holloway is not hers to bear alone. She seeks vengeance, and the one who opens the crypt shall become her vessel. The curse will pass through them, spreading until it finds its end. Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. It was him. He was the one who had disturbed the crypt, who had opened the door. He had unleashed the curse, and now there was no escaping it. "You are hers now," the whisper echoed in his mind, "and I will never let you go." Nathan's hands trembled as he clutched the paper, reading the cryptic words over and over. The weight of the truth settled on him like a suffocating blanket. The curse wasn't something he could escape. He had disturbed Margaret Holloway's grave, and now the price would be paid. The cemetery around him seemed to pulse with energy, as if the ground itself was alive and aware of his presence. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with their ominous chant. "You cannot outrun her. She's coming for you, Nathan. She has already claimed you." The cold air pressed in from all sides, and Nathan's breath came in sharp gasps. The oppressive atmosphere made it feel as though the very earth was closing in on him. He needed to act, but the fear that had gripped him made it hard to think clearly. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The air around him became frigid, and the shadows lengthened. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single, clear voice. "You should have never come back." Nathan's heart raced. He knew that voice. It was hers, Margaret's. Before he could react, the ground trembled. The tombstones around him seemed to shift, their faces contorting as if they were alive. The crypt in front of him seemed to grow darker, as though an invisible force was pulling him toward it. The air was thick with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then the woman appeared. Margaret Holloway stood before him, her long white gown tattered and stained, her face as pale as death itself. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and Nathan felt a rush of cold fear grip his chest. Her lips parted in a twisted, empty grin, revealing sharp, unnaturally long teeth. "You took what was never meant to be disturbed." Her voice was like ice, cutting through him. Nathan tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself was holding him in place, rooting him to the spot. "I will make you suffer as I did," she whispered, her voice growing louder and more menacing. "You will never be free." In a sudden flash of movement, she reached out, her hand cold and deathly, touching his chest. A searing pain spread through his body, as though his very soul was being torn apart. Nathan screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the force of the curse that was consuming him. Nathan's world went black. When he awoke, he was no longer in the cemetery. His surroundings were dim and unfamiliar, as though he was in a place between life and death. He could feel the weight of something pressing on his chest, something cold and unyielding. He tried to move, but his body felt numb, as though it no longer belonged to him. A voice echoed in his mind, the same voice that had whispered to him since the moment he opened the crypt. "You are mine now, Nathan." It wasn't just a curse, it was possession. He could feel Margaret inside him, her cold presence swirling within his thoughts, her bitterness and rage consuming his every breath. Her will had become his own, but Nathan was not ready to give in. He fought against her presence, pushing back with everything he had left. The pain in his chest intensified, but he refused to succumb. As he struggled, a strange sensation took over him, a burning, searing heat where Margaret's coldness once was. "No!" He heard her scream inside his mind. "You cannot fight me. I will destroy you." But Nathan's will was stronger now. With each heartbeat, he pushed back against her, clawing his way through the fog of her control. Finally, with a violent wrench, he broke free. The dark presence of Margaret Holloway faded, leaving him gasping for breath. But he knew this wasn't over. Margaret's curse had left its mark on him. She had claimed him, body and soul, and now the true battle was just beginning. Nathan returned to Chicago, though his mind was far from peaceful. The battle in the cemetery had not broken the curse. It had only shifted its power. Margaret had not been defeated. Instead, her presence had intertwined with his own. He could feel her waiting in the dark corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Her whispers were constant now, always just at the edge of his thoughts, like a shadow he couldn't escape. "You cannot escape me, Nathan." But now something else had changed. Nathan's body was no longer his own. The curse had infected him, left its mark on his soul. His reflection no longer seemed familiar. His eyes had changed, darkened, as though something malevolent was seeping out of him. As he passed a mirror one morning, he froze. His own reflection was smiling back at him, but it wasn't a smile of his own making. The reflection's grin stretched wider, more twisted, and the eyes that stared back at him were hollow, empty. "You're mine now," the reflection whispered. Nathan stumbled backward, horror flooding his veins. This wasn't just a curse, it was a transformation. The more he resisted, the stronger Margaret became. There was only one thing left to do. He had to find the way to destroy the curse, to sever the connection between himself and Margaret Holloway before it consumed him entirely. But as he began his search, he felt the whispers grow louder, stronger, closer. "You will never be free, Nathan." The true battle had begun. Nathan's days were filled with an insatiable need to understand the curse that now bound him. Every waking moment was consumed by the whispers that echoed in his mind, but he refused to give in. He couldn't. There had to be a way to break free from Margaret Holloway's grip. He spent hours researching in libraries, sifting through old books and manuscripts. He scoured online forums and contacted paranormal experts, desperate for any clue that could help him undo the curse. But everything he found only added to the weight of his fear. There were legends, myths, and tales of spirits that sought vengeance, but none were like Margaret's. The curse was ancient, tied to a specific ritual that Nathan had unknowingly triggered when he opened the crypt. He had disturbed the final resting place of a spirit that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. Margaret was a restless soul, bound by a need for revenge that transcended death. But there was something more to her curse, something darker. The more Nathan read, the more he realized that Margaret wasn't just haunting him. She was feeding off his fear. She had become a part of him, feeding on the very essence of his soul. His only hope now was to uncover the truth about her past, her death, her life, and to find a way to break the curse from the inside. But time was running out. Every night, as the darkness settled around him, he felt her closer. The whispers grew louder, the shadows more persistent. And then, one evening, he found it. In an old journal, tucked away in a hidden corner of the library, Nathan discovered a ritual that, if performed correctly, could sever the curse that bound him. But there was a price. The ritual required a sacrifice, one that would either free Nathan from Margaret's grasp or bind them together forever. The choice was his. Nathan sat alone in his apartment, the journal open in front of him. His eyes scanned the ancient text, the words blurring as the whispers in his mind grew louder. "Do it. You have no choice." The ritual was clear. It required specific ingredients, items connected to both Margaret and Nathan's bond. A shard of the crypt stone, a piece of his own hair, a drop of blood from each of them, and then the incantation that would either destroy the curse or bind them in eternal torment. But there was one final instruction, one Nathan hadn't seen until now. If the ritual is performed incorrectly, the curse will consume both souls. The bond will be unbreakable, and the curse will spread beyond the one who performed the ritual. The gravity of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no room for error. If he failed, if even one part of the ritual was wrong, Margaret's curse wouldn't just claim him. It would spread. It would spread like a plague, and he would be its vessel. The thought of it made his stomach churn. Nathan stood up, pacing around his apartment, trying to shake off the creeping dread that was beginning to take over. He had to do this. He had no choice. The whispers in his mind were growing more persistent. "You cannot escape. You will never escape." He reached for the items he had gathered for the ritual. A shard of stone from the crypt, a lock of his hair, a small vial of blood. He placed them on the table before him, his hands shaking as he carefully followed the instructions in the journal. Everything was ready. Now it was time for the incantation. As Nathan began to speak the words, a cold wind swept through the room, and the lights flickered. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voice of Margaret rising above them all. "You cannot stop this, Nathan." But Nathan continued, his voice steady, focused. The room grew colder. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving as if alive. The temperature dropped to freezing, and Nathan could feel Margaret's presence growing stronger. But he pressed on, his heart pounding in his chest. The final words of the incantation were spoken, and for a moment, everything went still. The silence was deafening, and then, without warning, the ground beneath Nathan's feet shook violently. The room seemed to collapse around him, and he was thrown to the floor, the air thick with an unnatural force. The shadows closed in, and Margaret's voice filled his mind. "You failed." Nathan gasped for breath, the weight of her words crushing him. He had done everything right, hadn't he? But then he saw it. A figure, shadowy, indistinct, standing in the doorway of his apartment. The shape of Margaret Holloway. "You belong to me now, Nathan." The finality in her voice was like a death sentence. Nathan had failed. He had performed the ritual, done everything he was supposed to do, but it wasn't enough. The curse had become too strong, too twisted. Margaret's hold on him was unbreakable. He could feel her presence everywhere now, inside him, around him. Her voice was a constant hum in the back of his mind, like a shadow he could never outrun. "You are mine." Her voice wasn't just in his mind anymore. It was in his body, in his very soul. He could feel her control over him growing stronger, her influence seeping into every part of him. He could hear her, see her in the corners of his vision, feel her cold touch on his skin. "You will never be free." The more he resisted, the stronger she became. His reflection, once his own, now belonged to her. It was as if she had taken over every part of him. His thoughts, his body, his very essence. Nathan was no longer just a victim of the curse. He was a part of it. And so, as the days passed, Nathan came to a horrifying realization. There was no escape. He was Margaret Holloway now. Forever. Nathan's existence became a blur, a never-ending cycle of shadow and cold. The whispers never stopped. The cold never ceased. Margaret's presence was woven into the very fabric of his being. Every movement, every thought, every breath he took was hers. There were moments, fleeting moments, when Nathan could feel himself, when he could almost break free from the suffocating grasp of Margaret's influence. But those moments were brief, like a light in the dark that flickered out before he could grasp it. At times, he would find himself standing in front of mirrors, staring into his own hollow eyes. The reflection no longer felt like his own. The face he saw was distorted, both his and Margaret's, merged into something grotesque. His body trembled, not with fear, but with the recognition that he was no longer human. He had become a vessel, a living, breathing anchor for Margaret's spirit. And the worst part was the realization that Margaret was not merely haunting him anymore. She had become him and he her. The curse had taken root so deeply that Nathan couldn't remember who he had been before. He couldn't remember the life he once led, the man he used to be. All that remained was Margaret's wrath, her cold vengeance, and the gnawing emptiness inside him. But as the days stretched on, Nathan began to feel something else, something darker. It wasn't just the curse anymore. Something was shifting. There was power in Margaret's presence, power that he had never noticed before. Nathan could feel it pulsing through him, like a dark tide that surged with every beat of his heart. It was more than just a possession. The curse had changed. Margaret's spirit had not only taken over his body, it had begun to meld with his soul in ways that were beyond understanding. He could sense her thoughts as if they were his own, hear her desires echoing in his mind, and slowly, as if it were a dark, twisted part of himself awakening, Nathan realized the truth. He didn't have to fight it. He could use it. There were ancient rituals, dark rituals that spoke of power beyond the grave. Power that could raise the dead. Power that could make one more than human. Margaret's curse was the gateway to something far greater than he had ever imagined. With his mind clouded by the whispers of his ancestors' vengeance, Nathan began to delve deeper into the forbidden knowledge he had once sought to escape. The rituals, the dark incantations, the blood sacrifices. They all seemed to offer a way to harness the power that had consumed him. But with each ritual he uncovered, the power grew stronger, and so did the presence of Margaret, who seemed to have begun to guide him. She whispered in his ear, urging him to perform the rites, to take control of the darkness that had overtaken them both. Together, we are unstoppable. Nathan felt it. He could feel the power surging through his veins as he chanted the forbidden words, as he embraced the full scope of the curse. The darkness grew inside him, twisting and shaping itself into something monstrous, something eternal. And as he finished the final incantation, he felt the unmistakable shift, a surge of power unlike anything he had ever known. His body burned with the force of it, and for a brief moment, Nathan felt free. He was no longer a prisoner of the curse. He was its master. Nathan's transformation was complete. The curse that had once trapped him, that had once belonged to Margaret Holloway alone, had become his. But he was more than just the vessel now. He had become the embodiment of the curse, a dark force that could not be contained. His mind had fractured, no longer bound by the constraints of humanity. Margaret's memories, her rage, her thirst for vengeance, had melded with his own. Together, they were unstoppable. With his newfound power, Nathan felt the pull of the cemetery again, the ancient ground calling him. The graveyard, the crypt, the shadows, they were all part of him now. He returned to Blackwell, but this time it was different. The town had changed. It had fallen under the same curse that now lived inside him. The streets were empty, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. The cemetery loomed in the distance, its gates wide open, waiting for him. As he stepped into the graveyard, the wind howled through the trees, and the tombstones seemed to shift and move in response to his presence. The shadows twisted, as though they were alive. And then Nathan saw her. Margaret Holloway stood at the center of the graveyard, her form more solid than he had ever seen before. She was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a spirit. She was alive, alive in him. "We are one now," she whispered, her voice no longer cold, but powerful. "We will make the world ours." Nathan nodded, feeling the full force of their combined power surge through him. He was no longer a man, no longer a victim of the curse. He had become something else, something dark, something eternal. The town of Blackwell was just the beginning. The world was next. The days that followed were a blur of shadows and power. Nathan, now fully embraced by the curse, had no need for sleep, for rest. The darkness had consumed him, and in return, it gave him strength. Strength beyond anything he had ever known. Margaret's spirit was a constant presence in his mind, guiding him, urging him to take control of the world that had once rejected them. Together, they were unstoppable, a force of vengeance and darkness that could not be denied. He returned to the cemetery, to the crypt where it all began. This time, there were no more obstacles, no more barriers between him and the power he sought. The ground beneath the crypt trembled, and the air grew thick with the weight of centuries-old spirits rising. The graveyard came to life, and from the shadows, the souls of the restless dead began to stir, summoned by the power that Nathan had unleashed. He was no longer just a man. He was a harbinger of the end. The world would fall, and in its place, darkness would reign. The whispers were gone. In their place, a single voice echoed in Nathan's mind, the voice of Margaret Holloway, now fully merged with his own. "We are the end, and we will not be stopped." The curse was no longer a curse. It was a beginning, the beginning of the end. The world seemed to tremble beneath Nathan's feet. Every step he took in Blackwell felt like an echo of something ancient and unstoppable. The ground, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to pulse with dark energy, shifting beneath his weight. It was as though the very earth was bowing to the power he had unleashed. The once quiet town was now a place of decay. The streets, once alive with the bustling of normal life, were empty, silent, except for the occasional whisper of the wind that seemed to carry a mournful tone. The once welcoming homes now stood abandoned, their doors creaking open as if awaiting the inevitable. The cemetery was alive, an extension of the power that had become Nathan's own. The tombstones no longer stood in silent rows. They shifted and moved like sentient beings, their stone faces warped with grotesque expressions of rage. From the shadows, the souls of the dead began to rise, swirling around Nathan in a sickening dance of spirits bound to him and Margaret. Nathan stood at the center of it all, feeling the strength of the curse coursing through his veins. The world was his to command now. Margaret's voice was a constant hum in his mind, guiding him, urging him to bring the darkness further into the world. "They are weak, Nathan," Margaret whispered. "They will bow before us. The world was never meant for the living. Only the dead will remain, and we will reign over them." The realization that there was no escape from this, no way back to the man he once was, began to settle into Nathan's soul. He had become something more than human, something eternal. The curse had reshaped him, made him into a harbinger of death. He had no place in the world of the living anymore. And so, with Margaret's presence fully entwined within him, Nathan took the first step of his new existence. The veil between life and death had already begun to dissolve. The balance had been tipped, and the dead no longer rested. They were now his army, his to command. With each passing hour, Nathan's influence grew stronger. The town of Blackwell, once a peaceful, quiet place, was now a broken shell. The streets that had once seen children playing were now littered with the decayed remnants of those who had fallen to Margaret's curse. The survivors, few as they were, had fled, their homes abandoned to the shadows. Nathan stood in the center of town, his eyes glowing with an eerie, supernatural light. The whispers around him grew louder, the voices of the dead, the spirits that had once been confined to the cemetery now scattered across the streets. They were bound to him, as if their souls had no will of their own, drawn to him by the curse he and Margaret had become. "The time has come," Margaret whispered in his mind, her voice echoing with power. "We will spread this darkness to every corner of the earth. The living will fall, and we will rise." Nathan raised his hands, and the sky darkened as if responding to his command. From the cemetery, the souls of the dead surged forward, rising from their graves, their twisted forms emerging from the earth like spectral shadows. They began to wander through the town, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. As they roamed, they sought out the few remaining living people who had been too afraid to leave. One by one, the survivors were pulled into the grasp of the dead, their screams drowned out by the wailing of the spirits. There was no escape. Nathan smiled as he watched the scene unfold. The power he had once feared was now his to wield, and with it, he would bring an end to the living world. He was no longer just a man cursed by an ancient spirit. He was the master of death itself. He turned to the cemetery, where Margaret's grave stood, the only tombstone untouched by the chaos he had wrought. But even as he approached it, he felt a shift in the air, a strange tug at his soul. It was as if the curse was no longer his alone, but something even more ancient and dangerous was awakening. The air was thick with the smell of decay and death. The once vibrant town of Blackwell had become a ghost town, its buildings crumbling under the weight of the curse. The streets, now slick with the remnants of the dead, lay still. But something was stirring beneath the surface, something darker than anything Nathan had ever encountered. The very land seemed to pulse with a new energy, an ancient, malevolent force that had been awakened by the curse he had unleashed. Margaret's voice, once so steady in Nathan's mind, began to tremble. "This is not what I wanted," she whispered, her tone filled with dread. "There is something else, something worse than me, beneath this town." Nathan turned to her, confusion and anger swirling within him. "What do you mean? This is ours. We've won. But Margaret's presence, once so powerful, seemed to be weakening. No, Nathan, she said, her voice distant. We have awakened something older, something that does not follow our rules. We are its servants now, not the other way around. Nathan felt the ground shake beneath his feet, and a low rumble echoed through the earth. The cemetery began to tremble as if something beneath it was coming to life. The tombstones cracked, and the earth split open, revealing something unimaginable, an ancient, monstrous force that had been buried for centuries. From the depths of the earth, a massive, shadowy figure began to rise. Its form was indistinct, made of shifting shadows and darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a crimson hue that burned through the darkness. It was not of this world. It was the true source of the curse. Nathan took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. What is that? Margaret's voice trembled in his mind. That is the one who cursed me, the one who cursed all of us. And now it is free. We cannot control it. The creature's presence was overwhelming. Its very essence twisted reality, making the air thick with terror. The spirits that had risen from the graves recoiled, their forms flickering and disappearing, as if even they feared the creature. Nathan felt his body tremble, but he could not look away. The power that had consumed him seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to the ancient force before him. The ground beneath Nathan's feet cracked open, and the creature's shadow began to stretch across the town, its tendrils of darkness reaching for everything in its path. Margaret's presence in his mind had gone silent, and Nathan realized with a shock that she was no longer there. The ancient entity had taken her, consumed her, as if she were nothing more than a fleeting memory. Now, Nathan stood alone, surrounded by the darkness, watching as the monster emerged from the earth in its full, terrifying form. You are nothing, the creature rumbled, its voice echoing in the very bones of the earth. You awakened me, and now you will be my servant. Your world will fall, and you will serve me for eternity. Nathan felt the weight of its words settle on him like a tombstone. The curse he had sought to control, the power he had embraced, was nothing compared to the ancient being that now towered over him. There was no escape. The world would end, and Nathan, the once cursed man, would remain a part of the darkness forever. The creature loomed over Nathan, its form now fully revealed, a mass of shifting shadows, its crimson eyes burning with an ancient, insatiable hunger. Nathan could feel the weight of its gaze piercing through him, a force far beyond anything he had ever encountered. The power he had once wielded, the curse that had consumed him, now felt insignificant, fragile in comparison to the entity that stood before him. The ground trembled violently, and a deep, rumbling voice echoed from the creature, sending a chill down Nathan's spine. You are nothing. You have awakened me, and now your world will crumble beneath my feet. Nathan's mind, still struggling to comprehend the scale of what had been unleashed, was overwhelmed by the crushing presence of the creature. Every inch of Blackwell seemed to shudder and darken as the entity's influence spread like a disease. The air grew thick with despair, the earth itself groaning under the weight of the ancient curse that had bound it. For a moment, Nathan felt lost, the last remnants of his humanity fading into the abyss. The darkness had always been a part of him, but now it consumed him entirely. He had sought immortality, power, control over the dead, but what he had awakened was far beyond anything he could control. In that instant, a flash of clarity struck Nathan. The curse, the rituals, the power, it had all been a mistake. He had become a pawn in something far older, far more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. He was no longer the master of death. He was its servant. The creature's form stretched and coiled, its shadow extending across the town, enveloping everything in a cold, suffocating darkness. The spirits of the dead, once under Nathan's command, now screamed in terror as they were swept away by the overwhelming power of the ancient entity. You were foolish to think you could control me, the creature growled, its voice shaking the very foundations of the earth. Now, you will join the others, trapped in the endless dark, Your soul's bound to me for eternity." Nathan's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his body trembling as the crushing weight of the creature's power engulfed him. He had become nothing more than a fleeting shadow in the grand scheme of the entity's eternal reign. As the last remnants of his will faltered, Nathan realized the true cost of his quest for power. He had wanted immortality to transcend death, but in doing so, he had brought forth the end of all things, the end of Blackwell, the end of the living, the end of the world itself. The town of Blackwell was no more. Where once there had been streets and buildings, now there was only an empty, desolate expanse. The cemetery had been swallowed by the darkness, its tombstones and graves consumed by the shadow that had risen from the earth. The once proud town, now reduced to nothing, was a mere memory, a forgotten place, lost to the ages. The creature, now fully awake and free from the prison of its burial, stood at the center of the void, its eyes glowing with a triumphant red light. The world around it was silent, still, save for the whispers of the dead, now enslaved to its will. Nathan was no more. The man who had once walked the earth, driven by ambition and greed, had been consumed by the very darkness he had sought to control. His body, his soul were now part of the eternal void, trapped forever within the creature's realm. And so, the darkness spread, its reach extending beyond the borders of Blackwell, beyond the town that had once been. The creature's influence grew, a slow and insidious tide that would consume everything. The world of the living would fall, and only the dead would remain. The cycle had come full circle. What had once been a curse was now an eternal reign of darkness.